and welcome to Assessments 101, the where, when, and how of measuring outcomes. This short professional development training should give you a better idea of how we use assessments in the classroom and throughout our programs. In order to achieve that, we're going to look at a number of things. Why we bother to assess achievement, and when should we assess it? How this all relates to learning outcomes, the various types of assessment, and we're really going to focus primarily on what's available in Moodle, as opposed to all the various forms of assessment, the methods you can use to assess, and how this all relates to program-level assessments. There is really just one question to be answered when it comes to assessments, and that is, as you see here, did the instruction really do what it was supposed to do? If not, then we're not doing our instruction properly. But this question has sort of a hidden meaning behind it, because it begs the question, well, what is instruction supposed to do? 7 magic words. The bottom line behind all instruction is it has to help our students to achieve the learning outcomes. Anything that is not related to the learning outcomes, no matter how often we assess it, no matter what we may call it, is not really focused on the instructional outcomes. It's not really focused on what we're trying to assess. So let's take a pause for a moment here and look at the wheel of assessment and how it relates to all the various things that go on within our classroom. First of all, as you can see in the center, there's this fuzzy, nebulous idea of needs. And we can get this from a number of areas. We can use our PAC committees and talk to potential employers and determine what it is that they're seeking in potential graduates from our programs. From that, we can determine, well, what skill sets, what specific skills are required, and perhaps what soft skills. But it is still fuzzy because each employer is going to have their own particular take on what they want in an employee or what this person wants in a supervisor. But we're looking at a broader view of what needs to be done in order for us to have a stellar graduate, someone that can not just do the first job that is presented to them, but in fact move forward through their careers and get better and better jobs with more and more responsibility. But at least it gives us a starting point. From these needs, we develop our learning outcomes, both at the level of the program learning outcomes and at a lower level, the course learning outcomes. In both cases, they are focused on trying to meet those needs. Now, once we have the learning outcomes, that determines the instruction. Really, as the train would indicate, the learning outcomes drive the train in this situation. Everything is based on trying to meet the learning outcomes. So the learning outcomes determine how we're going to instruct our courses. And from the instruction, we then create both tests and assessments. Now, notice there are 2 separate bubbles. These are not actually the same activity. Instead, testing is what we more commonly look at as classroom tests. It determines whether or not a particular action was achieved in the classroom. Did the students read the book? We'll give them a quiz on the chapter. Did they, in fact, understand what was in the chapter? Okay, we'll go ahead and have them answer the end of chapter questions. But the learning objectives are not, did the student read the chapter? The chapters, the textbook, those activities are there to help us meet whatever the learning objective is. So a test is a nice way of sort of doing a pulse check on what's going on in the classroom, but we're more focused on assessments, which may or may not be part of the general testing that goes on. The assessments tie back directly to the learning outcomes. Did we achieve the learning outcomes? That's really what assessment is all about. So while testing may help us in our assessment of whether or not the learning outcomes were actually achieved, they're not a direct measure. We need to come up with a form of assessment that allows us to go ahead and measure this. Now, in terms of type of assessments, there are 2 basic flavors, just like there were for learning outcomes. There are direct or overt, and indirect or covert. Now, the direct are really easy. I can see them. If I'm looking at something like I want you to hammer a nail in a board, I can watch you hammer the nail and see if it goes in the board. It's fairly simple. It's straightforward. There's nothing hidden. However, on the indirect or covert, it's much harder. If you've ever driven by an officer that's pulled someone over late at night for drunk driving, you can see that they've got him standing on one leg or trying to touch their nose with their eyes closed or doing something else. It's a physical activity. They're not trying to see if they can stand on one leg. They're not trying to see if they can walk a straight line. They are using those as direct assessments of an indirect outcome. Are you or are you not actually inebriated? That's not a real good measurement, because what happens if instead of being inebriated, I simply have a bad hip? Then I can fall over. It doesn't mean I'm drunk, it means I have a bad hip. However, a direct assessment of inebriation is the breathalyzer or a blood test. That tells you very clearly, here's how much alcohol is in the system. Based on our standards, are you or are you not intoxicated? So you have to look at both variants of assessment in order to get a good idea of whether or not learning outcomes were achieved in the classroom. For instance, let's look at this young lady in the picture. Is she angry? Is she upset? Does she have a crick in her neck? Is she just frustrated? Well, depending on how you answered that question, you may or may not be accurate. In other words, you're going to bring your own prejudices into your assessment of this picture. Your understanding of human nature is what's going to be used to determine what her facial expression means. Now, when we're making assessments, one of the things we want to do is to try to minimize the impact of our own prejudices, of our own backgrounds. Truthfully, it's almost impossible to do it 100%, but the more that we can remove the instructor from the equation, the more accurate our assessment is going to be. So we do like to try to come up with direct assessments if possible, but if not, we need to come up with indirect assessments that use a direct assessment. In other words, if I want to find out whether or not you're creative, I don't simply just look at you and say, okay, I guess you're a creative type because you dress in a unique way or you talk in a unique way. Instead, I try to determine how creative you are by a physical output. I'll ask you to paint a picture or write a poem or do something else that I can then judge to see how creative it may be. Now, in Moodle, there are all sorts of assessment tools that are available. You see the list here. They're referred to as activities. But if you'll notice, many of these activities are not really assessment tools, at least not in the sense of how do I go about and create an activity that will show me that the learning outcomes were actually met. For instance, attendance. Is attendance an assessment? Yes, it is. However, does it really lead to our learning outcomes? Do we have learning outcomes that are based on whether or not you showed up for class? Not really. The reason we assess things like attendance has nothing to do with education per se. You know, we're using it for things like federal funding or VA funding or state or accrediting board activities where they say you have to have the students in the seats. They can't be able to learn if they're not there. True, but it doesn't tell me that the outcomes are actually met. None of our classes have an outcome that says you will show up. Okay, those are policies, those are procedures, but they're not learning outcomes. However, something like an assignment is an assessment. I can have you write a paper to see if you know how to communicate in English. I can have you perform a lab activity to see if you know how to actually apply some of the material. I can have you create a glossary. Turn it in as an assignment, as opposed to a regular assignment, adds another level that's not directly accessible as one of our learning outcomes, but is still important. In other words, if the outcome is to be able to communicate well, both orally and in writing, when I give you an assignment that is a written assignment, if it's your work, that's a good assessment. If it's not your work as a student, then it is a poor assessment. So turn it in allows me to remove bad inputs. It tells me this is not actually the student's work, and therefore you should not use this to determine whether or not the student has met the outcomes. That's different than saying that the outcome is thou shalt not plagiarize. Well, we're not going to cover all these assessment tools, but what I want you to remember is as you're looking at these assessments, you need to determine how you match these up with the learning outcomes. You have to use the right tool for the outcome, which kind of then says, well, how do I know that? Good question. Goes back to Bloom. If we look at the lower levels of Bloom's taxonomy, knowledge, comprehension, and application, you can see that even if you've never taught a class before, you could go in, look at the learning outcomes, pull out the verbs, and determine what level I should be teaching. If the learning outcomes are simply name 4 household pets, I don't have to really go in depth in a description of zoology and phylogeny and how various animal families are related. I just have to let you know this is a cat, this is a dog, this is a hamster, this is a gerbil. On the other hand, if I'm talking about comprehension, I've got to teach a little more in depth so that you can be able to explain why people have pets. Application, again, another deeper level of learning. Now you have to try to apply this by, say, recognizing various types of household pets when given images or pictures of them. Each of these lower levels of Bloom's taxonomy have appropriate assessment tools. The tools can kind of float around. It kind of depends on how you write them. Multiple choice questions, yes, they're fairly simplistic, but if you write them well, they can be used all the way up into application and perhaps even beyond. But you'll notice, as we're looking at these appropriate assessment tools, as we move up the pyramid, up the taxonomy, not only is it more work for the student, it's also more work for the instructor. It takes a lot more effort to grade an essay question than it does to grade a multiple choice question, for instance. So once we've covered these lower level assessments, we have to look then at the upper level assessments. In Bloom's taxonomy, these are the ones that relate to critical thinking, the analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. Again, far more work for the student and far more work for the instructor. This is where those rubrics come in that we've talked about in earlier lessons. If I create good rubrics, my workload as a grader of critical thinking activities and assessments is far lower. More importantly, having a rubric allows me to have cross-instructor or cross-course abilities, where I can look at the same assessment between two teachers to see what's going on. So when you're looking at critical thinking, what kind of activities, what kind of assessments can I actually use? Well, thinking is normally shown through expression. So here you see writing a paper, fairly traditional way of doing this, giving a presentation. There's nothing that allows you to learn like having to teach. Okay. Demonstrations, arguing a case, a very difficult level of critical thinking, being able to understand not only what the key parts are, or the key points are, for a given activity, but also what the counter-arguments are, and how you would deal with those counter-arguments. At a somewhat lower level, just a basic persuasion, both orally or in writing. Any of these can be used to demonstrate critical thinking skills on the part of the student. And if your learning outcomes relate at that level of critical thinking, you want to assess using these kind of activities. It again all goes back to the learning outcomes. Now, at a bigger picture, you have the program level. We've been focusing on the course level because, let's face it, most instructors deal with what goes on in their classroom. They don't deal with the overall curricula, the overall program. However, it's the same idea, just writ larger. So when I'm looking at the program, I am sort of hanging these courses and the various learning activities within those courses together in a string to allow a student to go from point A, hi, how are you, my name is Bob, all the way down to being a successful graduate that has the skills and knowledge necessary to succeed based on our learning. So when you're looking at program level assessments, you're understanding the big picture and you're trying to assess within a class how that skill is learned as it relates to the overall program. Which means if you're given a course that has a program level assessment, you can't mess with it. You've got to make sure you give it just the way that it is described. That way we can measure it from class to class, from year to year, from instructor to instructor. You need to use the rubrics that are provided. So again, we have that consistency. It is not an optional activity. You have to do it, and you have to do it the way we give it to you, even if it's not the way you would do it yourself. There is a bigger purpose for it, and you need to go ahead and use that properly. That's pretty much it for Assessments 101. This was a broad overview of what goes on in your classroom in terms of assessments. We'll have other lessons that go more in depth with each type of assessment downstream. But for now, what we want you to take away is, once again, learning outcomes are critical. That's what drives the train. That's what determines how instruction works. That's what determines how assessments are done. It's all about being appropriate and meeting those learning outcomes. And again, if you have program assessments built into your class, please give them as written. Do not modify them. Thank you much. I hope this was useful, and have a wonderful day.